name was Johannes Brahms, and he was born on May 7th, 1833. This is his story, and this is his music. The Brahms family lived in the bustling big port city of Hamburg, Germany. There were 3 children, of which Johannes was the oldest, and Father Brahms often found it difficult to feed his hungry family. Hannes, as he was usually called, always remembered how his father would come home late at night from his job as horn player in the band of the Hamburg militia, and how there would be nothing for him to eat. But despite their great poverty, it was a happy household. Besides playing the horn, Father Brahms played the double bass, the flute, the violin, the trumpet. In fact, he played almost every instrument you could name. It was from him that Hannes received his first real understanding of music. Even though the Brahms family was very poor, enough money was saved to give the children a good schooling. Hannes tried to study hard, but in the back of his mind, there was always just one thing: music. Soon, it was obvious to the parents that Hannes' inclination was irresistible. "Very well," said the father. "Let Hannes become an orchestra player like myself." At once, Brahms was introduced to the violin, the double bass, and the cello. But the little boy had ideas of his own, and string instruments were not among them. He wanted to play the piano. As stubborn as his father was, Hannes was more stubborn, and at last, at age 7, he was sent to study with one of Hamburg's finest teachers, Wilhelm Kassel. How lucky he was to have so fine and understanding a teacher. Kassel soon found that he was teaching a lad of more than ordinary talents. What was at first an hour's piano lesson was soon stretched to 3 hours, and finally Hannes would stay at Kassel's home for days on end and never come home. In fact, Kassel finally had to move his home closer to the Brahms house so that Hannes could begin his lessons sooner. By the time he had reached the age of 10, Hannes' proud father arranged a little concert for him, at which he played the difficult piano part of the Beethoven Piano Quintet. By the merest chance, a certain impresario heard that concert and begged Hannes' father and mother to let the boy come to the United States. "Why, he'll make you rich," the man told them. But although the parents were eager, Kassel talked them out of it because Hannes was far from ready yet. About that time, Kassel reluctantly told the boy, "Hannes, I have nothing more to teach you. From now on, you are to be taught by Eduard Marxen." Marxen was a really famous teacher and soon became the firm friend of Hannes. Indeed, he thought so much of him that he charged nothing for his lessons. But it was not only piano that Hannes learned from Marxen, but composition. From him grew his first deep understanding of folk music, which was to show itself again and again in the works of later years. More and more, the young man began to turn to composition and dream about being a composer. Then came his first solo recital, and very soon after that, his second. To tell the truth, they were not too successful. There were two reasons for this. First, Brahms refused to play what he considered the silly and frivolous works which were so popular in his day. Also, he had quite made up his mind not to be a pianist at all, but a composer. Quietly, but with great energy, he began to compose a piano sonata, a scherzo, and a number of songs which were to develop later into such masterpieces as the Serenade. But the young composer was so self-critical that he destroyed a great deal of what he wrote, thinking it not good enough to be heard. At that time, Brahms was quite unknown to the world, but in 1853, a turning point was reached in his life. On April 19th of that year, Johannes left Hamburg, after prolonged farewells to his family, to become the accompanist of the famous Hungarian violinist Edward Remenyi. A few short months later, he was to return to Hamburg, a famous musician. Traveling with a violinist was a mixed blessing. Remenyi was sometimes hard to get along with, but otherwise Brahms enjoyed himself and got much valuable experience. When the two were visiting Hanover, Remenyi took Brahms to see one of the most famous musicians of the age, Joseph Joachim, the renowned composer and violinist. Although Remenyi did most of the talking, it was Brahms who made the deepest impression on Joachim. In a matter of minutes, the two had formed a lifelong friendship. The next step in the joint tour was Weimar, where Brahms was introduced to the famous Franz Liszt. Such an introduction could have done great things for Brahms, for Liszt immediately realized the young man's talent. But Brahms was a stubborn boy even in those days, and did not like Liszt's circle of friends, or indeed Liszt's music very much. In fact, the story goes that Hannes fell asleep when Liszt was playing for him. Naturally, Liszt was no longer interested in the stubborn young man from Hamburg. As a result of this, Remenyi, from whom Brahms had been stealing the limelight, refused to allow Brahms to continue his tour with him. So Hannes, bewildered and with hardly a cent of money, went to visit his new friend, Joachim. While Brahms was staying with his kind friend in Göttingen, Joachim persuaded him to visit the renowned composer Robert Schumann. When Brahms arrived at the Schumann home, the door was opened by one of their 6 children, and Brahms was immediately introduced to Robert. Schumann asked him to play one of his piano compositions, and Brahms had no more than started to play when Schumann brusquely interrupted him and strode to the staircase. "Clara," he called. "Clara, come down here." When his wife, a famous pianist, arrived, Schumann waved Brahms back to the piano and said, "Now you will hear such music as you never heard before." The generous Schumann could not do enough for Brahms. He recommended him to the famous publisher, Breitkopf and Hertel, and soon they were to pay Johannes his first small fees. Schumann introduced him to his friends, many of whom were to help the composer greatly. But most of all, he wrote an article in which he spoke about Johannes Brahms, whose first compositions were created in obscurity and silence. He is, Schumann continued, the Messiah of music. He who is to come. Such praise, and for one so young, would he live up to it? These were the questions that all Germany was asking. But one thing was certain. When Johannes returned to Hamburg, he was a famous man. Hannes was in Hanover with Joachim now, and in that lovely city, he set to work on such compositions as the Trio, Opus 8. While there, he met a man who was to be a lifelong friend and one of his greatest champions, the famous conductor and pianist Hans van Bülow. In fact, it was van Bülow who gave the first performance of a Brahms work in public. It was the sonata in C major. During this happy period, he was visited by 2 of his favorite friends, the Schumanns. He spent a jolly week with them, playing and talking. Then, shortly after Robert and Clara had returned home, Brahms received a telegram that Robert, who was suffering from a mental illness, had tried to commit suicide. Nothing would do but that Brahms should rush to Clara's side to help her in her time of need. Poor Robert was in an institution, hopelessly insane. About then, Brahms accepted a post as choirmaster at the princely court of Detmold. While he was there, he composed several important works, including the 2 serenades, a sextet, and, most important, he began work on a piano concerto. As you can hear, this great work in D minor is not what we'd expect of a young man hardly 26 years old. It is a serious composition needing much listening to fully appreciate its beauty. When it was first performed with Brahms at the piano and Joachim conducting, it was received coolly, and later in Leipzig, it was roundly booed. The public was just not ready for so serious a piece of music. The concertos they understood were short, not almost 50 minutes in length, and not so gloomy. But Brahms couldn't have cared less. In later life, he was to suffer many musical defeats, but perhaps he realized that eventually the critics and public would see things his way. While in Hamburg for a visit, he conducted a young ladies' choir, which was his particular pride and joy. Sometimes he conducted them in the park while he'd sit in the branches of a tree, waving a baton. One of these dear girls of mine, as Brahms was always calling them, was a certain Bertha Porubsky. When Bertha married and had a child, Brahms wrote for her the most tender lullaby known to music, the famous Wiegenlied.